Hey everybody, you don't know how excited I am to have this man back on the show. Third time. I think very few people have been on the Truth two times or more. Here's his latest book, which of course is going to make it impossible for the rest of us to get any attention because he will be monopolizing the success of the publishing world. Jordan, how you doing?
Hi, Gad. Nice of you to invite me. I'm
Oh,
looking forward to talking with you.
likewise. So this is Beyond
I'd like
Order.
to point out that my book is actually better bound than that one, generally speaking. So it
Well,
actually looks like this. So,
I did as a friend. I didn't want to say that I felt a bit upset that I was receiving this advanced reading copy rather than the final one. So please tell
well,
your
it's
publisher.
surprising. I haven't even seen that. I didn't know anyone was receiving that. So you'll probably get a hardcover in the mail one of these days.
Wonderful. And this follows up on. I don't think I need to introduce anybody to this one. I think we're at 6 million now. Is that right?
Yes, I think it's 6 million.
That's
Yes,
unbelievable.
it
So
is unbelievable. It like many things, it's unbelievable.
I mean, if I would have asked you to be as optimistic as possible in terms of the type of impact your book was going to have, it'd probably be lesser than what ended up happening. But what would have been your best guess if you were putting on your full optimistic hat?
Oh, certainly nothing like what's happened, especially because it's not just the book, right? It's obviously the YouTube videos and podcasts. This wasn't comprehensible. It wasn't even technologically comprehensible 15 years ago, much less psychologically comprehensible. And it's still not psychologically comprehensible to me. So yes, it's been crazily successful.
And
And I don't know what to make of it, to tell you the truth.
I mean, before we delve into your latest book, you went from someone who was certainly well known within the academic circles, but certainly not, transcending outside of academia to, being, a household name within, popular culture. How have you handled? How has it been for you? I mean, I could imagine because I know from myself, it's difficult to walk anywhere without somebody stopping you. For you, it must be even that much more so. How do you handle it? Are there any
Well,
downsides? Are you happy about it? Does it make you feel good? What's your general feeling?
I'm certainly ridiculously fortunate in that. It's not reasonable to complain about success. Um, you write a book in the hopes that it will sell. You put forward your ideas in the hopes that people will find them useful, and I suppose, well, that attention will be drawn to them. Do you want attention drawn to you? Well, probably. I mean, I would say yes and no to that to some degree. But look, people treat me extraordinarily well when they stop me in public. They're always extremely polite to me, with almost no exceptions. Two exceptions: one drunk woman in Dublin, and someone who was clearly somewhat unhinged in Toronto, and out of thousands of encounters. So I don't know. I think it would be unbearable if that wasn't the case, if
Yeah.
people were responding negatively, face to face. That's bad enough when it's mediated through social media, but face to face, I don't think I could handle that. But luckily, I don't have to. Thank God for that.
Well, I mean, there seems to be. I mean, if you look at the negativity that one might receive on social media, and if you were to extrapolate sort of a one-to-one relationship in terms of how people might respond to you in person, then you would think, oh my God, I'm going to get beaten up or accosted violently. And yet, in exactly the same way as you, I can't remember a single time where anybody's ever come up to me who hasn't been anything short of lovely, courteous, kind, not a bad word. I mean, probably the only thing that I've seen that I could complain about when someone approaches me is when they solicit your attention and then proceed to sort of lecture you about their thoughts for the next 25 minutes, where you have to kind of sit politely and patiently listening to them. That's probably the only sort of negative interaction I've had.
Yeah, well, at some of the protests, things got uncomfortable. At Queen's University, one of the students, I don't think he was a student, or maybe he was a previous student at Queen's, he was in my face for about 2 blocks after the talk I gave with the law professor, Oh man, how embarrassing. I'm so bad with names. I know him, Bruce Party. Thank God I got that because I know Bruce well. He was in my face in a very aggressive way for about 2.5 blocks, and
Wow.
that was, my son was with me, and that was quite uncomfortable. And the security that Queens had provided had no idea what to do with him. They're not trained for that sort of thing.
Right.
So they didn't know what to do. So that was extremely unpleasant. But there were demonstrators there. It wasn't surprising. It's amazing the impact of the book and the YouTube videos, all of that. I think I don't know how to get my head around it. I've said that many times, but I think it's partly because I was older when this happened.
Right.
It's not that easy to readjust. I don't know what you've noticed, but I've noticed that people have sort of a limited number of radical transformations in them. Some people, you go back to a high school reunion and you see some people and they haven't changed at all since they were 16. They didn't have any transformations in them. And then you see someone else and maybe they changed once when they were 20, and you get the odd person who changes 3 or 4 times. But the probability of a radical transformation seems to decrease as you get older. And it is difficult for me to adjust to whoever the hell I am now because I don't understand it. And it's also because I'm not lecturing at the university and I don't have my clinical practice anymore. And so, and then the last 2 years have been, very disruptive in a variety of ways as well. So it's also difficult to get a handle on exactly what the success of the book and the ideas means. I was looking last night. I looked up Jordan Peterson merchandise, which is something I haven't done for about 2 years, I think. And I was just idly sort of thumbing through my phone. And that was a little trip all in itself. There's posters and clothing and some of it. I have some merchandise. My son runs that because we noticed that people were merchandising and thought we could offer something in that vein. But there's everything under the sun, and it always shocks me.
Do you ever think, well, of course, we're going to delve into this full throttle in a second, but just to kind of get some of the personal pleasantries out of the way, do you at all miss wearing those other hats as a professor and as a clinician? Or do you think that you've turned, you've not turned your back, but you're doing something else now and you're unlikely to return to them? How do you feel vis-a-vis those two hats?
It's very difficult to say because my health is so compromised that I can't separate out concerns from grief, let's say, for the loss of my previous occupations. It was certainly, I liked being a professor a lot, and I liked my clinical practice a lot, and it was very stable and predictable. There was plenty of variation within it, obviously, as much as you want, really, but the structure was very useful to me, and that's gone. And I'm not sure what I'll do with regards to my university career in the future. I don't know if I'm healthy enough to pursue it. That's issue number 1. And then issue number 2 is, I don't know if I can go back. It's not always the case that you can go back to what you were, or who you were. That back doesn't exist. And I think, for example, if I want to lecture, let's say I get healthy enough so that I could lecture again reliably, I made a course on personality that I taped it in 4 days, and we've been marketing that, and it sold many tens of thousands of copies. And, I could make an endless stream of courses and deliver them directly to the public, and then I could lecture about whatever I wanted, and there'd be no administrative overhead, and there'd be no political correctness. And so then I think, well, is it reasonable to go back and lecture to classes of 100 people about things I've already lectured about? I could do new lectures, I suppose. Or should I take advantage of this new technology and the reach that it enables, that it provides for me? And I don't know.
In my case, I haven't left academia, and I'm still steeped in all sorts of research and so on. I think for me, what I find most difficult to deal with is, there's a velocity to the reach that you have. I checked, I think 2 days ago, the number of views that our chat on your show. You were kind enough to invite me on your show. And I think we were, over 1.2 million. And of course, I mean, as professors, we have to publish in peer-reviewed journals, and that's how you advance a field, and it's all good. But the reality is that, you could work on a peer-reviewed project for 3 years with a 10% likelihood of getting it published in a top journal. And if in 5 years after it's published, 100 people cite it, then you're very excited that this was a really important paper. Whereas I could turn on the camera and chat with Jordan Peterson, and suddenly 1 million, 2 million, 3 people have listened. And I understand you're not comparing apples to apples, but there is a velocity and speed of reach and size of reach that makes it increasingly burdensome to do a lot of the things that typically we would have taken for granted as part of our jobs as professors. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it isn't easy to weigh those considerations. Like, I don't know how to weigh, for those of you who don't know anything or much about scientific papers, as Gad pointed out, if you get 100 citations, which means that other scientists refer to your paper in 100 papers, that's a classic. Like, that's a home run. Now, there are papers that have thousands of citations, but those things are bloody rare, and tens of thousands is virtually unheard of. Freud, Zizek, the linguist, Chomsky, right? There's a few scientists who manage tens of thousands of citations, but never hundreds of thousands and never millions. And then you wonder too, well, what's your obligation to education? As a professor, and quantity has something to do with that. It's not everything, but also one of the things about YouTube that makes it different than a university is that the only people that are watching you on YouTube are the people that actually want to watch you.
Right.
Now, I'm not complaining about the undergraduates. I don't complain about undergraduates, at least in their relationship to my lecturing. I love teaching undergraduates. But that doesn't mean that all of them are equally committed to the subject material. And whereas it's all voluntary online, and so there's something about that that's... And then I do find there is a burdensome element to the academic environment. And you and I have focused on this a lot. Now if I write a grant application, and those things eat up a lot of time. In the United States, if you're an academic, a grant writing will eat up 40 or 50% of your time. In Canada, it's actually better than that. It's easier to get grants here, although they're smaller, but that's okay. But now you have to write up a diversity, inclusivity, and equity statement, it's like, I think, well, and if it isn't acceptable, they can toss out your grant application. And I think, fuck you, really, Well, it's like, look, I loved being a scientist, it was great. But it isn't a favor to me precisely that I'm allowed to be a scientist. I'm trying to contribute.
Right.
And people, it isn't good for motivation to have to jump through unrelated hoops. It's already very difficult to do a scientific experiment.
And I think there's an element to academia that stifles innovation, because the bureaucracy is so heavy that you end up having, administrative meetings for 2 hours to decide about the wording of a motion. Then you vote on that motion. Meanwhile, you and I could have gotten on YouTube and just pontificated from the top of our heads. And again, we've reached 50, 100, 200,000 people. So again, it's all about this inertia, this burdensome inertia that if only there was a way for us to kind of fast track innovations and innovative thinking, and maybe one day universities will become, more rapid in
their... Well, they're going to have to, because the technology is demanding it, but it is, and the lag time is really punishing. It's really punitive, especially when you add in the extra months that it takes you to run something through an ethics committee, let's say. And
And have you noticed, by the way, Jordan? Sorry to interrupt you.
No
the ethics boards, as I often tell my students when they ask me how long is it going to take, professor, for us to get through, and I tell them, in the golden age of psychology in this 50s, 60s, and 70s, you could literally harm people psychologically permanently, and as long as you were doing it to advance science, there was no oversight. Right? Think about some of the classic experiments that we now teach in our courses. They would never clear any ethical board. And now we've swung to the exact opposite end, where if you ask someone their biological sex or how much income they make, just the most basic demographic questions in a survey, you haven't even gotten to the substantive part of the study, then all sorts of people on the ethics boards will start raising all sorts of inane issues. And so again, it's so burdensome. Do you think that there'll be an autocorrective mechanism where we'll go back to some reasonable...
No, I don't. Well, I don't. Look, the scientific enterprise is only 300 or 400 years old. Now, you could trace its roots back to the Greeks, but not much farther than that. But let's say 2,000 to 400 years old. I'll stick with 400 for the sake of this discussion. It only emerged in one place, It emerged in Western Europe, essentially. It's a delicate thing. And we don't know the conditions that were necessary to enable its existence. And we don't know what we're mucking up to stop it from continuing. No, I don't. So given its delicacy, you need people who are very, very dedicated, who are very intelligent, who are very protected, who are funded, who have freedom of inquiry. You need a publishing infrastructure. You need a peer network. Yeah, but you really need a culture of free investigation and untrammeled scientific curiosity. And the reason you need that, you think about it, like, let's assume that to be a professor, you need an intelligence level that's about 3 standard deviations above the mean, which is approximately correct. It'd be between 2 and 3, but 3 isn't unreasonable, especially if you're going to work at the high end. People like that generally have many other things they could do. So, like, they could go make money, for example, if they're entrepreneurial. They could be successful in business, even on a non-entrepreneurial level. Why be a scientist?
Right.
It's hard. You can have a decent life and you can have your security, and that's great. And I'm not complaining about it. But the fundamental reason to do science, if you're a scientist, is because it's fun. It's like, let's discover something. Well, if you pile enough impediments on top of that, it's like, well, that's not interesting anymore. I'll go do something else. I'll write a book. I'll do anything else. I'll do something else. And,
right.
I found that in my own career. It was like, well, I'll give you an example. I started my career doing research in alcoholism, and we studied a very particular population. They were sons of male alcoholics, non-alcoholic sons of male alcoholics. Now, they had to be sons of male alcoholics because if your mother was an alcoholic, you might have fetal alcohol syndrome. And that would have interfered with what we were looking at. We were looking at psychophysiological response to stressors, sober and under alcohol, and then just response to alcohol, physiological response. And our subjects had to have an alcoholic father and an alcoholic grandfather on the paternal line, and at least one other first or second degree male alcoholic relative. And so we were looking at the biological basis of alcoholism, working on the hypothesis that there's a genetic component, which there clearly is. Okay, but to do that research, well, we couldn't study, as I said, we couldn't study females or people with alcoholic mothers. Sorry.
You're good.
Message just came up. No, a message came up. Never mind. We couldn't study our sons of female alcoholics, as I said, because of fetal alcohol syndrome. Well, we also had to get these people fairly drunk. So, because the effects we were looking at wouldn't kick in until about 0.08. So they would come into our lab and get 3 shots of alcohol in 20 minutes. And then their blood alcohol would ramp up. And most of the physiological effects that we were studying were only observable on the ascending limb of the blood alcohol curve. So in that first 20 minutes to half an hour. And if you're if you're a pleasure drinker, rather than drinking to ameliorate anxiety, you want to stay on that ascending limb, which is why people often continue drinking once they start. In any case, I had to stop doing that research. Why? Well, the ethics committees and the granting agencies started to demand that half the research subjects had to be female. Well, it's like, well, alcoholism is primarily a male problem, and we were looking at the male pattern of heredity. So we couldn't even do it in principle. Plus, we couldn't study sons of female alcoholics. So that was like, that's a big problem. And then the next thing that happened was that we would usually we'd get our subjects intoxicated in the lab, and then we'd keep them there until blood alcohol level went down to about 0.04, and then we'd usually send them home in a taxi or something like that. Well, the NIAAA, National Institute of Alcoholism and Alcohol Abuse in the US, mandated that you had to keep your research subjects in the lab till they had a blood alcohol level of 0.02. And so that meant that those guys had to hang around for like 8 hours in the lab, sobering up. They were not happy about that. They never come back twice. And so it just killed it. It was like, well, there was about 5 years there where we could give subjects alcohol and see what happened. And all of the preconditions vanished. And now no one does it. No one.
Wow.
It's dead.
Well, you're lucky that you didn't study prostatitis, because if you would have had to get half the population to be women who have prostates, it might have been difficult. But now with the transgender movement, that is possible, correct?
I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot.
Oh, you don't want to go back to your original haunting grounds, huh? All right, Jordan, let's...
I was thinking a lot more about that recently, too, and that's something we could talk about at some point. I've been thinking a lot more about identity and about what's going on in the culture wars, so we can refer back to that at some point. But anyways, we were all talking about...
Let's jump into the book. So my first couple of questions that I planned for you are kind of broad, and then if you'd like, we can get into some of the specific rules in the latest book. So I guess my first question, and give me 2-3 minutes to set it up if you don't mind.
Sure.
So I'm very much of a synthetic thinker. I like to look for synthesis or consilience, as I think we might have discussed in the past. And it's something that I often refer to in my own writings. It's just the way my brain works. And so I became interested in psychology of decision making originally. I did my PhD was in studying the type of stopping policies that we use when we stop acquiring additional information and commit to a choice. And the reason why I was very interested in this problem is because it could be applied to anything. It could be applied to how we stop and choose a mate to marry, how we stop and choose between two cars, how we choose between political candidates. It's a universal...
it's an incredibly complicated problem.
Exactly.
It's an unbelievably complicated problem.
That's right.
When do you have enough information? Because
exactly.
you never have sufficient information, really.
Exactly. And so because of my ability to then transport that knowledge to many, many different domains, and hence try to get some kind of unity of knowledge, that excited me. Then when I went into evolutionary psychology and, applying evolutionary psychology in the behavioral sciences in general and consumer behavior in particular, I saw evolutionary psychology as the unifying meta framework to be used across the behavioral sciences. And so that excited me. And so putting on that lens of seeking consilience, I look at your two books and I see, okay, there are 12, great rules in book 1, another 12 in book 2. And of course, I understand that these were generated in a bottom-up process. You famously talk about, you went on Quora and people generated these. And so it's very much, as someone who was housed in a business school, I'm excited when I see you referring to, it was the perfect market research, process. But if I'm putting on my hat of consilience, I'm saying, how can I create a taxonomy for these original 12 rules and these new 12 rules? Can I create a taxonomy using, I know you know this, but let me explain it for the general audience. So factor analysis is a data reduction technique where you take, let's say, 40 items, and then you reduce them to three underlying factors or structures. Let's say an IQ test. It might be verbal intelligence, spatial intelligence, and quantitative intelligence. You may have used many, many items to start off with to gauge these constructs, but then you distill them down to 3 factors. So you use either confirmatory factor analysis or exploratory factor analysis. So when I was going through these rules in your 2 books, I'm saying, okay, I'd like to come up, even though we can't literally use factor analysis because you didn't collect the right data to actually do that analysis, is there a conceptual, quote, factor analysis that we might have used to organize these now 24 rules? What's your thinking about this? How would you answer that?
Oh, I'd say there's no doubt that that's the case. I know what the factors are even.
Okay, go for it.
It's a phenomenological theory, essentially. So phenomenology is the analysis of the full domain of human experience. It's different than consideration of the objective world. If you think of the objective world as real, you get rid of what's subjective. Now, obviously, that has tremendous utility. And who knows, it might even be the best way of getting at what reality really is. We don't know that, but it could be. In any case, if you're speaking phenomenologically, you think of reality as the subjective and the objective. And so your phenomenological experience includes your experience of the objective world insofar as you can have that experience, but also your emotions and motivations and dreams and everything about your experience that other people don't have access to. Your pain, for example, your pleasure. I think the phenomenological world has a structure, and it's good versus evil. It has a narrative structure. It's good versus evil against a background of order and chaos. And the rules, at least the way I wrote them, discussed them, are all discussed in relationship to that underlying idea, to that underlying framework.
So they all can be.
They all touch on that.
They all and they're all fighting. They're on the good end of the good-evil, continuum, and they are seeking order in an otherwise chaotic world. That's
no, I wouldn't say the first part. Hopefully, is right. They're hopefully oriented towards the good and orienting other people towards the good. Although I spend a fair bit of time talking about malevolence and evil, I wouldn't say that they're on the side of order, because that's a mistake. That's why there are 2 books, one black and one white, because one is a critique of chaos, let's say, and its excesses, and the other is a critique of order and its excesses. And the proper, you can have too much order. That's that you have too much order in your life when you feel stultified and bored and everything's old and dead, nothing's new and engaging. And when you have too much chaos in your life, primarily because you become anxious, but you can also experience all the pain-like motivations as well, or deprivation-like motivations. So sometimes order is the right antidote if there's too much chaos, but sometimes chaos and uncertainty are the antidote because you need to spice up your life. But having said that, what you're looking for constantly is balance. And I actually think your nervous system is biologically, what would you say? It's biologically prepared to indicate to you when you found that balance. And it's
well, in the parasitic mind, I refer to homeostasis, right? So that would be, if you like.
This is like it's one step past the homeostatic idea, not necessarily the way that you laid it out in your book, but the problem with homeostasis as a theory is that the theory implicitly presumes environmental stability. Like if the environment is unchanging, then you can hit a homeostatic position, which is balanced, and you've got it. But that doesn't work because the environment keeps moving around. So you need homeostasis plus exploration, because otherwise you can't update the homeostasis as it drifts away from the environment. And so I think that's coded deeply, that idea of the environment drifting away. It's why structures age of their own accord. If you're not attending to your house, it decays. You have to continually upgrade it and maintain it. And it's the same with your psychological structures, because they're aiming at something that keeps shape-shifting.
And how did you, so in light of what you just explained about the two axioms or axes that you were referring to, how then does a given rule make it into, I mean, in a sense, I'm asking you a conceptual question, but also a creative question, right? Because there are undoubtedly many more. I think it was 40 rules that were generated, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the exact number.
42, yeah.
42. So then what is the, as somebody who studies psychology of decision making, what is the decision rule by which you decided on which rule, right? So what is the meta decision of rule choosing that you used in your two books?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I think the answer to that was that it was obvious to me that I had something to say about them. And then, so that was the first thing. And the second thing was, it was obvious that the things I had to say about them could be grouped together in a book, right? Because if a book isn't just a collection of essays, it has to have some coherence across the chapters. And I wanted each of the chapters to stand alone, but I wanted them to add to each other as a book, because otherwise they could just be chapters, let's say. And so it had the rule had to, I had to be able to address the rule in a manner that would allow me to address both of those criteria. And so some of them were kind of outliers, and I couldn't see how to weave them into a coherent narrative.
Before I'm going to get to the next sort of broad question about your latest book, but since you mentioned writing and how you had to choose specific rules so that because you can write about them and had things to say about them, maybe you could discuss, there are a lot of undoubtedly aspiring authors who are going to be listening to certainly this chat, if not some of our past chats. What are some tips that you have? And I know that you've got a module where you explain to people how to self-author and so on.
Yeah, I have an essay on my website. I think it's under recommended books. Let me just check very quickly while we're doing this, because people could go and take a look at that. My students always found it useful. I don't want to take us too far afield here, but yeah, on my website, jordanbpeterson.com, under online exercises, there's a writing guide. It's just a Word document essay, and I wrote it for my students, trying to tell them how to write, actually, like what you actually do when you're sitting down. And so I always wrote in the morning, or almost always, because that's when I was sharpest. I spent some time every day writing for years and years. I haven't done that recently, but if you're going to write, one of the things you have to understand if you're going to write is that no one is ever going to make time for you to write. Right. You have to steal it. And that's the truth. That's the case for any creative endeavor. You like to think your time is your own, and you like to think you have lots of it, and sometimes you do have more than you know what to do with. But in any case, very frequently, your time isn't your own. You have to fight like a mad dog to get any of it. And because a book is such, you have to delay gratification or even evidence that what you're doing is useful for such a long period of time. You're going to lose faith in it, so are the people around you, and they're going to fight for your time. And so you have to be a junkyard dog and protect your creative time. That also means you shouldn't try to steal too much of it. Like if you write for 30 minutes a day, that's great. If you can do that consistently, if you can get it up to 3 hours a day, that's stellar. You're never going to manage more than that, I don't think.
Yeah, I used to. So there are many tips that I also can share about, what would be a good way to become a good writer and so on. I mean, the mechanistics of good writing. But in terms of what you're referring to, sort of the daily self-discipline, I mean, you said junkyard dog. I mean, in when I attack a new book, I sort of set the ground. Okay, the publisher has said I have to turn the first draft in 12 months, 14 months, whatever it is. And the publisher wants 70,000 words, 80,000 words. What is the absolute minimal number of words that I should generate every day if I were to eventually have the requisite number of words? And it might be 400 or 500 words a day. Now some days it's a bit less, some days you're feeling really free and you produce 3 times as much, but you have to have that daily commitment. I may have bronchitis and I'm having a hard time breathing because I'm coughing that day, or I've had a very long day at school, I've taught 2 lectures. But if you find ways by which you kind of kick the can forward and say, today I'm too tired, today I'm too sick, today I'm too busy, then you'll and so I think
you'll never do it.
You never do. So there's this
No.
this brutal, punishing, exacting self-discipline that, as you said, you have to be a junkyard dog. Otherwise, you're never going to turn it in, right?
Yeah, well, it is because it's also a pie in the sky enterprise.
Exactly.
It's like, what makes you think your stupid book is going to be worth writing? You know, and most books sink without a trace. Well, most books languish. Most books aren't written. That's the first thing. Those that are written usually end up in a drawer.
Right, indeed. Are you there? Yeah, you froze for a second. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Back. There.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect.
Of those that do get sent to an agent, a fraction get published. Of those who get published, almost none succeed. They disappear within a week or two.
Yeah, I think my publisher gave me a number in trying to contextualize, how well my book was doing, since it was released. He said, I hope I don't get this wrong. I think he said that 0.1% of all books will sell 10,000 copies by year one. 0.1%.
Right.
So 10,000. So contextualize your 6 million with it. So, I mean, outlier is not the right number. It's an outlier of an outlier to the exponent of outlier. So it truly is ultimately a gamble that most people will fail at. But I think we do it because I don't know if I'm sure you feel the same way. I get this need to be creative, right? So very much
that's
the way,
because you're open. That's a good illustration of the personality trait and its biological basis. Like creative people, open people, that's their currency. That's what they have to offer people. And if they don't do it, then they wither on the vine. It's like extroverted people not being allowed to socialize.
It's so
they
spot
can't
on.
live.
It is so spot on. You beautifully said. Okay, let's go to question 2 in the general thing. So, are you familiar, Jordan, with the Fishbein attitudinal model from way back in your graduate studies? Does that ring a bell or not really?
No, I don't think so. It might if you explain it a little bit.
Okay, so Fishbein is a model that consumer psychologists have used a lot historically. So it basically says if I'm trying to calculate my attitude towards an object, the object could be a person, it could be a car, it could be whatever. So there's an attitude. I love Mazda. I love Jordan Peterson. Okay. The way that I do that calculation is I take each of the attributes that define Jordan Peterson, his eloquence, his humility, whatever it is, different attributes, and I score those attributes, and then I multiply them by an importance weight for each of those attributes, so that the final attitudinal position that I hold towards Mazda or Jordan or my wife-to-be it's a summation of each of the attribute values multiplied by their importance weights. Okay?
Yeah, so it's a rational choice model, essentially.
Exactly. And so, again, using my hat as a behavioral decision theory guy, I look at these 12 rules from book 1 and 12 rules in book 2, and I say, number 1, what is the currency that you're trying to maximize? Is it contentment? Is it a purposeful life? Is it happiness? So that notwithstanding, I'd like you to answer that. Surely, I mean, although it implicitly assumes in your 2 books that all of these rules are equally weighted, so you see now why I mentioned the Fishbein, surely they don't impart equal influence in whatever the currency is. So let's say happiness were the currency. Maybe rule 7, all other things equal, if I instantiate rule 7 fully, that might bring me more bang for my buck than rule 3, and therefore it has greater weight in that sense. So having offered you that framework, how do you view all of those rules? Number 1, what's the common currency? And are they all equally weighted in achieving whatever that maximal currency is?
Well, I think what I've been driven by mostly is the desire to control the manifestation of certain kinds of negative emotion. In Rule 11, in the latest book, the rule is
do not
allow
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to read it for you.
Yeah.
Do not allow yourself to become resentful, deceitful, or arrogant. Go.
Yeah. Well, I've always been obsessed with the events of World War II, the genocidal events of World War II. And I was obsessed with that mostly as a psychological phenomenon rather than a political phenomenon. I was more interested in the motivations of the people who undertook the terrible acts that characterized the Holocaust. And equally so, the terrible acts that characterized Mao's China and Stalin's Soviet Union. There's other examples that could have been chosen, but those are sufficiently miserable, I would say. I learned, I think, that, and this is partly why I became so obsessed, or have become obsessed with the story of Cain and Abel, is that life is hard enough so that if you don't find your way forward to a meaningful engagement, you will become corrupted. And as you become corrupted, you become dangerous, not only to yourself, but to other people. And beyond that, because you can become dangerous beyond that. You can become dangerous to the structure of being itself, I think. But we don't have to go that far necessarily. Well, perhaps we do. I mean, the idea of crimes against humanity starts to touch on that, right? The idea that there is such a thing as a crime against humanity means that there are crimes that are so egregious, that are so black, that are so deadly, that you're not to engage in them regardless of your cultural background, right? They're transcendently evil. And, you can debate whether or not that's true, but there's costs to saying that it's not true, just as there are costs to saying that it is true. So I've always been interested in what the antidote to that is. What's the antidote to the bitter resentment that can drive you towards violence, vengeful violence? And its meaning, as far as I can tell, you have to have something worthwhile. And I don't believe that that's happiness. And it's not that I don't. Happiness, that's a gift. No one in their right mind would offer up a fundamental critique of happiness. It can make you impulsive. We've studied that. Positive emotion can make you impulsive. It has its dangers, but that's not the point. But regardless of that, it's meaningful engagement that allows people to bear their lives without becoming resentful because of the suffering. And so I've tried my whole life, I would say, to lay out that idea, but also the pathways to that meaningful engagement. And increasingly, I started, and I think this is highlighted particularly in the second book, that most people find that meaningful engagement in the adoption of some kind of difficult responsibility.
But do you think, so for any one of those end goals, so to go back to my original question, whether it be Rule 11, or we can certainly touch upon all the rules if you'd like, are there some that inherently their pursuit will result in a greater util or delta towards that end goal? So even though
I think there's one in particular.
Okay, go for it.
Well, it would be in the first book. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Yes. See, I'll tell you, I like that one, because if you remember in the Parasitic Mind, when I'm describing my personal history, both in Lebanon, and what are the ideals, the scripts that shape my own personal trajectory, if you remember, I gave two of them. I said the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of freedom, because then I could identify endless subsequent decisions and trajectories that I've taken that are meant to not violate or to instantiate those two overriding goals. And so in a sense, it goes back to my first question of seeking consilience. By only identifying those two rules, or I'll just say two words, truth and freedom. And now, let me explain how I was able to then create consilience. So when I'm trying to prove to you that freedom matters to me, I didn't simply restrict the discussion of freedom to, freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry, which is the typical stuff that you might expect me to say. I had to look inward, introspectively, to other completely different domains where the pursuit of freedom, or the inhibition of my freedom caused me great grief. So, for example, I used to be a competitive soccer player, and I used to play what's called the number 10 position, which is the playmaker position. The person who plays the playmaker position is the person who kind of floats around the field trying to look for spaces to take, right? Now, when I have a coach who would put positional restrictions on me, today you're playing more on the left side of midfield. It's not because I was a prima donna or a diva and I don't want to listen to the coach, but by you restricting the freedom of my movement, you are taking a fundamental part of how I viewed the field. And so here I was showing you an example of how my desire and my ideal of freedom was manifested in this case, not in freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry and so on, but in freedom of movement on a soccer field. So it's in that spirit that when I look at your 24 rules, each of them I could look at them and say, oh yeah, I like this. This is good stuff. There's a lot of wisdom there. But I want to collapse them. I want to condense them. I want to create consilience. I want to walk away not with 24 rules, with 3 fundamental rules that distill the 24 rules. Do you follow what I'm saying?
Yes, definitely. Well, I don't know if I got to think if there's another rule that would be as tightly associated with the core of the book as do not, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. I wrote it like that because it's not that easy to tell the truth because, what do you know? But you can train yourself not to say things that you know are untrue.
Right.
And that's a good start. You can do that.
Well, I think number 6, which let me mention it, number 6 in your new book, Abandon Ideology, in a sense goes well with Tell the Truth, because when you are not ideologically committed, then you are unencumbered by political tribalism, right? I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm not a liberal or a conservative. I'm someone who judges each position on its own merits and flaws, and therefore it's hard to pigeonhole me in terms of what my political tribe is. And so I can easily see abandon ideology as subsumed within the one that you said was the most important one in your first book, which is Tell the Truth. To tell the truth is to be non-ideological, because once you are ideological, in a sense, you corrupt truth in order to adhere to your political tribe, no?
Well, the objection that will come up to that rule, of course, constantly is, well, every system of thought is an ideology. And so we could probably wander down that rabbit hole for a minute or two,
Sure.
Because it's worth doing. It's sort of like the social psychologists often talk about stereotypes. And that's always been something that's bothered me, because it isn't clear to me how you distinguish a stereotype from a perception. Now, and that's akin to the distinction between an ideology and, let's say, a truth. It's certainly the case that in order to perceive the world and to act in it, we have to simplify it. And so then you might say, well, any simplification, is basically a compression algorithm of some sort, and there's no distinction between that and an ideology. But I would say an ideology is actually a biased compression algorithm. And so it does give you an account of the world, but it leaves things out that are crucially important. Now, the objection is, well, you have a viewpoint and it's a simplification of the world. And what gives you the right to say that your viewpoint isn't an ideology like all other ideologies? And my answer to that would be, well, I made the case for that in 3 books, most particularly in Maps of Meaning. And what I tried to do in that book was to lay out what I thought were the minimal preconditions for a worldview that wasn't biased a priori. And so that meant was, for me, was that the representation had to take account of the positive elements of nature and the unknown and the negative elements. And it had to take account of the positive aspects of culture and the negative aspects, and it had to take account of the positive aspects of the individual and the negative elements. So that's 6 characters, and they're generally, that's my impression, they're generally personified in narrative. So those characters, and what we think of as narrative is actually a map of the interaction between those domains. There's a 7th element, which I won't go into, which is the totality of all 6, but I won't go into that at the moment. So here's something you could think of as an ideology that maps onto that. So imagine the environmentalist story. It's a powerful narrative. It's powerful, I think, because it draws its motive power from this underlying structure, the one I just laid out. The environmentalist thinks of nature symbolically as positive, Gaia, right? It's the all-benevolent Earth Mother. As of culture as negative. It's tyranny, the military-industrial complex, and the rape of the pristine wilderness. And tends to think of the individual as negative as well, the ambitious, power-hungry, striving proto-industrialist who goes out in this terrible cultural machine and rapes nature. Avatar, the movie, has that structure. Right, and it's a compelling story because culture does rape nature, so to speak. Nature is beautiful, and individuals can be malevolent and corrupt and grasping and self-indulgent, and so you can tell that's a powerful story, and it is the story that animates the environmentalist movement. Right. But there's a counter story that's equally powerful and equally necessary, and that's actually the frontier myth. And so in the frontier myth, nature is desolate, waste, and barren, but waiting. Culture is the thing that, applied to nature, makes everything flourish, and the individual is the heroic trekker into the unknown and the tamer of the wilderness. It's like, well, is that a motivating story? Well, it brought Europeans in droves to North America. And it's the story, too, that you tell yourself when you're a scientist and you go out on the frontier of knowledge. So then you might say, well, and I do think the environmentalist story, by the way, is a reactive counterpart to the frontier myth. You know, there's reasons one followed the other. Maybe the frontier myth became too dominant, you know. In any case, you might say, well, which of those stories are true? And the answer is, well, they're both true, but together they're more true than either of them apart. Right. And that's a problem because then you have a paradox. It's like, and, you know, we don't like paradoxes. It's like, well, are people good or evil? Well, they're good and evil. Well, but an object can't be one thing and its opposite. Well, a person can. Is culture benevolent or tyrannical? Well, it's both. Is nature creative or destructive? Well, it's both. And an ideologies only take pieces of that story and tell them. And they're very compelling because they're pseudo-religious. Right. Now, Freud's a good example because Freud's theory was actually potent in large part because it wasn't an ideology. Freud actually got the mythological structure right. So you have the id, that's nature within. But Freud, it isn't positive or negative, it's both. And you have the superego, and that's culture, or the interiorization of culture, and it's positive and negative. It can have a tyrannical aspect, but it also controls and socializes you. And then there's the ego. That's the individual, but that's got a positive and negative element as well. So Freud's model samples randomly from the entire domain of phenomenological experience, let's say, and compresses, but it's not biased. Now, there may be biases in Freud's theory. That's not the point. I'm looking overall at the narrative structure of his theory. Because one of the things you have to ask yourself about Freud is, well, why the hell were his ideas so compelling? And the answer is, as far as I can tell, is that he offered a story that described the human psyche that had the same richness as a religious narrative, right? The same completeness. And the time was right because the religious narrative, especially for educated people, was starting to lose its validity.
But could one not argue that some of your success is due to the fact that you've been able to achieve exactly what you just said about Freud, and that, you know, there's a part of you that wears the hat of the professor scientist, you know, so there's that authority. There's a part of you that's the, you know, I'm the surgeon of the psyche that has delved into the deep recesses of the human mind as a clinician. There's a part of you that, you know, through your narrative about, you know, folklore and myth and your Jungian interest and some of your religious interests adds this extra layer. And it's the combination of these separate elements that I think has allowed you to be catapulted to the level of success that you've reached. Because I think if you didn't have, now I may, and we may talk about this if you'd like, about some of the Jungian stuff and so on, I may say, well, from a scientific perspective, yeah, I'm not into that, and here are the reasons why. But we
should talk about that, because I think you probably are more than you think.
A Jungian.
Yeah, well, I can, because you're an evolutionary.
Right. So let's hold off a second.
So we should talk about that.
Okay, we will. I have it on my list. We will.
Okay.
But do you agree that with my analysis that by you having those multiple unique features, the authority of the professor scientist, the legitimacy of the surgeon of the human psyche as a clinician, and that extra, I don't want to call it supernatural, but that element of religiosity combined with mythology, you put it together, it becomes a irresistible allure that makes a lot of people uniquely interested in what you have to say.
I think it's harder to throw me away because of that. People have questioned my scientific credibility, but I'm actually a credible scientist. I have a high
over 10,000 citations.
Yes, and so that's. I don't want to dwell on that, but it's sufficiently respectable so that it can't be casually dismissed.
Well, I remember when the people who attacked Lindsay Shepherd. You probably remember it, right?
Yes, I remember.
I put up your H index and your being your dogged defender. I said, well, let's put up Jordan Peterson's bibliometric scores next to these noble, virtuous professors, and I think I made my point pretty clearly there.
Yeah, well, for people who don't know, one of the ways you judge the accomplishments of a scientist and their reputational credibility is by looking at how many papers they have that have had reasonably high numbers of citations. And there's this complex index, which is how many papers you have that have an index. I can't even explain it properly simply.
Where the number of citations is higher than the rank of the paper.
Right.
And so that's called the H index.
If you had 30 papers with more than 30 citations,
exactly,
you'd have an H index of 30.
Exactly.
And so that's one way of, so that's number of papers, which is a quantity measure, which is one of the indexes of productivity. And then the citation count per se is a quality index, hypothetically. It's as good as one as we have. And so the H index takes quantity and quality into account. That's the theory. So people who don't like my views because they're not sufficiently scientific can't say, well, he's no scientist, because by the way scientists are measured, I actually am a scientist. And then on the mythological end, the religious end, well, those narratives pack a wallop. Like, I do believe that, and I should have known this, and perhaps I even did. If you play with archetypes, it's very risky to play with archetypes, and I'm not exactly playing with them. I was trying to understand them and to communicate their nature, but they're fire in the most primordial sense. And so if you enter that domain, say the domain of the discussion of archetypes, you're very likely to get involved in something that resembles an archetypal game. There's I can tell you too, if you want to look at how this works, if you want to understand this, anybody that's listening, there's two things you could watch. You could watch Apocalypse Now, and then Heart of Darkness, which is a documentary made about Apocalypse Now, because Apocalypse Now is an archetypal film, and all of the director and all the actors that made it got caught up in the archetype, and it just about killed Coppola. It was Coppola directed that, right? Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's great. And then there's another documentary called Hitman Heart, which is about professional wrestling.
Oh, right.
And it's a great documentary. And Bret Hart plays an archetypal role, and for a long time he was the most famous Canadian in the world, and he was the good guy in wrestling. And pro wrestling is a good against evil drama played out on a background of chaos and order. Now, it's not as sophisticated, abstractly speaking, as a movie or a book, but it's still a narrative, and people get engaged in it because of the narrative. And anyways, if you watch this, because Bret Hart gets caught up in this, and it's very interesting to see what happens to him as a consequence of getting caught up in it. But I'm telling an archetypal story in a variety of ways. Like the landscape that I situate my essays in is an archetypal narrative landscape, and that grabs people, almost by definition. And then I make overt reference to archetypal themes, and so and that people can't live without those themes. So when we were going to.
Oh, you froze.
We were gonna talk a little bit about archetypes.
So can I first give you my whole thing, and then you'll come in, because since I'm the one who has objections against it, okay? Mm-hmm. People know your positions on Jungian, so let me tell you. Okay, so here are the places where I'm going to propose that we're in absolute agreement, and then I'll propose places where we might disagree. You ready?
Sure. Yep.
So look, in two of my previous books, in both the Evolutionary Basis of Consumption and in the Consuming Instinct, I have chapters on cultural products. And I refer to cultural products as fossils of the human mind. And you're going to really like this, because it's going to jive very well with some of your own Jungian positions. So when I talk about fossils of the human mind, what I'm basically arguing is that human minds don't fossilize, they're organic. But what does fossilize are the cultural products that human minds leave behind. So you and I can listen to an ancient Greek poem where he's talking about sexual jealousy or status anxiety, and we could completely understand what he is referring to, because the software that's running his brain is actually identical to yours and mine, notwithstanding the fact that we know what an iPhone is and what a plane is, and he doesn't.
Okay, let me stop you just for one sec, because in order to get this discussion to work properly, I'm going to have to let what you say sort of echo. And if an echo catches something that's relevant, I got to catch it, because I won't be able to remember it. Okay, you just described something that's important, and that's so important that it's actually archetypal.
Yes.
The idea that ideas fossilize and become archaic, that's the old, archaic, decrepit, dying king. And it's an unbelievably old story. The Egyptians had it, and it's precise. Like the fact that you saw it as important is I would say an example of your pattern recognition capability.
Right.
And it is something that human beings have always had to contend with. The old pattern that once worked, established by people in their prime, becomes archaic with time. And there's two archetypal reasons for that. One is entropy, just thermodynamic decay. The environment changes and they remain static and there's a drift. But the other archetypal cause is the sins of men, and that's willful blindness. So imagine you're possessed by an archaic idea that's no longer updated, no longer up to date. It's going to produce errors in its implementation. All you have to do is turn a blind eye to those errors, and you'll speed the process of deterioration.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay, so,
I'm with you.
All right, so I'm going to leave that. And,
okay, so continuing. So I could then study universal patterns of human nature. So look, this is going to sound as though it's now Jungian, right? In the following scientific way. So if I want to study song lyrics, I could look at Urdu songs or Arabic songs, or the troubadours of 800 years ago, and I could show, using evolutionary principles from human mating, that the things that men sing about in terms of the desired attributes of women, or the things that women sing about in terms of the ideal male partner, are hauntingly similar, whether you sing them 800 years ago or today, or whether it's in Urdu or French or Arabic, right? And so in that sense, I could apply the formal mechanisms of content analysis to study the content of these fossils of the human mind, right? Now, so then let's take archetypes, for example. There are studies that have been done on, say, romance novels, right? So romance novels are, to put on my hat of a consumer psychologist, they are predominantly consumed by women around the world. There is no culture that's ever existed where men consume romance novels more than women do. So they are written for half of humanity called women. And so if I want to study certain fundamental features of, say, female fantasy or female sexual fantasy, then I could study the archetype of the male hero in romance novels, and it's going to tell me something incredibly powerful about the universality across all women. And that is, the male is a high status guy, he's a risk taker, he wrestles alligators on his six-pack stomach, and then he wins. He is tall. He is a neurosurgeon, an accountant, and a professor, right? And it's literally a cut and paste. Every romance novel has the exact same archetype of the ideal male hero. Now, in all that I just said, when I began with the fossils of the human mind and moved on to using even the word male archetype, it was always grounded in the scientific method. I didn't need to go to ghosts and the occult and synchronicity and so on. So there is an element of Jung which when I read, I say, oh, I clearly see how Jordan would completely think that I am actually quite in agreement with Jung, and I get it. I could tick it off. But then Jung goes into other areas, into the crazy methodological stuff, the impenetrable prose. I don't understand that prose because I'm too dumb and I don't have the capacity for profound thinking. So this is where I lose him. In other words,
I got to tell you, Gad, I haven't read very many people that I didn't think I was smart enough to understand, but Jung would fall into that category. Like, because I've had that experience too. I think, Christ, this is impenetrable. And usually I can understand, but my experience has been, if I persevere, I realized that he's talking about something that's so goddamn smart that I didn't even have a clue that the question existed.
But even if I were to concede that, so I concede, you and I are simply too much of dullards to understand Carl Jung. I'll concede that.
Well, you kind of have to be obsessed, though, too. This is a problem. Like, the problem with Jung, I would say, is that it's like looking at an impressionist painting. You have to get a long ways back from it before it coalesces, and you have to read an awful lot of Jung before you can make sense of any of it. And that's, like, you're not going to do that unless you're caught by it for some reason. And I was caught by it because I was so interested in the issue of human malevolence. And so I was compelled, and I read pretty much everything that Jung published up till about 1990. There's books that have come out since then that I haven't read. But like his book, Ion, for example, that's a book on astrology, but it's not. You see, it's exactly what you just described with regards to the romance novel. So what Jung did in Ion was he took astrological writings that had been collected over thousands of years from multiple cultures, and he saw that as an eons-long fantasy, hence the word Ion in the title, that was projected out into the sky. So here's the theory, and it's a great theory. So imagine that you're looking at the absolutely unknown, and for you, with the romance novels, that might be the female psyche.
Right.
Okay, and then you look at how you look at fantasy as a guide to the contents of that. So when people who didn't understand space from the objective perspective looked into the sky, they were possessed by a feeling of awe, and they fantasized about what might be up there. And they filled the sky with fantasy, which meant that they really saw the sky through fantasy. And the fantasy was astrology. And so Jung analyzed astrology as a collection of fantasies that revealed structures of the human psyche. And what he pulled out of that was, in some sense, prophetic intuitions. So you imagine that when you already described yourself as a pattern-oriented thinker, so you look at something you don't understand, you see patterns in it, you extract out the patterns, they seem meaningful, then you parse them up into explicit statements and test them. But the fantasy comes first. And the fantasy does have a prophetic element in some sense, because the fantasy contains the seeds of the ideas that will be at some point. Anyways, that's Ion.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yes, absolutely.
So every one of those statements, including the ones that we agreed we're too dumb to follow, which frankly I don't agree with, but I'm conceding out of politeness. Okay, but if we agree that all those things were truly profound, should they not be amenable to what you and I would agree is the only epistemological tool for adjudicating statements of knowledge, which is the scientific method? And
I think they are. I think
they are.
The analysis of romance novels is, look, a lot of the people that I knew as a scientist who were interested in Jungian ideas were affective neuroscientists and evolutionary biologists. Because they saw that Jung thought of the archetype as the reflection of an instinct in fantasy. And that's a lovely way of putting it. And like your assessment of the romance novel, you immediately move into archetypal territory. What women are looking for is the archetypal hero.
Right.
In a particular manifestation, romantically speaking. But so the guy has to be a bold explorer of the unknown, somewhat of an iconoclast, willing to break rules. When that's appropriate, right?
Yes.
When only the cowards are following the rules,
right.
The hero will break them. He has to gain something new, and then he has to share it.
But none of this stuff has to be with astrology, with the occult, with booga booga mythology.
But let's go back to the astrology though, because I made a case there. Jung wasn't an astrologer. He was looking at astrology as a repository of exactly the same kind of fantasy that you see in romance novels, except it was a fantasy that had to do with the manner in which the future was going to emerge. And so Ion is his deepest look at astrology, but that didn't make him an astrologer. Now, look, he had a mystical bent, and he was unbelievably high in openness. And so his ideas go beyond let me see, I got to get this exactly
I think you were going to say beyond the scientific method.
Well, there's no doubt that that's the case.
Isn't that a problem?
Yeah. Oh, well, but that doesn't mean they're not amenable to empirical investigation. Like it isn't exact. It's not like his ideas were derived from laboratory research, although the association experiments were. But look, it's better to think of Jung as a hypothesis generator, and that's part of the scientific method, right? And it's a very understudied part of the scientific method. When you teach graduate students, you almost never teach them how to generate hypotheses. You teach them what a hypothesis is and how to test it. But the mechanism of hypothesis generation remains opaque. And Jung is a great hypothesis generator.
I think the problem is that, you're a lot more steeped in the scientific method because you do have a high H index. You did publish in peer-reviewed journals. So even though there is an allure for you to Jung, you have a history within the scientific method. But the few Jungian analysts, for example, that I've ever spoken to, almost dismiss the possibility that we should worry about which parts of Jungian content is amenable to falsification, is open to the scientific method versus not, because they will use something that is similar to what you...
There's only two Jungians whose writings I've found useful.
Okay.
Yeah, Erich Neumann,
right,
who wrote an amazing book on the Great Mother, which is essentially a collection of ideas about the symbols of the unknown. It's a brilliant book. It's brilliant. And he wrote another one called Origins and History of Consciousness, which is it's a rebuff to Freudianism to some degree, and also to Ernest Becker. It's like the opposite of Ernest Becker's book. Ernest Becker wrote The Denial of Death, and he called people failed heroes, essentially, something like that. That's a very nutshell encapsulation of what's a great book. But Erich Neumann didn't think of human beings as failed heroes. He thought of them as heroes in the classic sense. It's a brilliant book, one that Camille Paglia really appreciates, by the way, surprisingly enough, in some sense. But so there's Neumann, there's a woman named Marie von Franz, who wrote a great book on Jung's ideas on alchemy, and she understood them. And other than that, like as soon as you leave the central core of the writings, well, there's Joseph Campbell, whose Hero with a Thousand Faces is a great book. But as soon as you leave that core set of writings, it deteriorates instantly.
It gets hokey pokey stuff, right?
Yeah. But I don't, with the original writings, that's... Now, there's one other thing I want to defend, sort of, the synchronicity idea, because that's one of the ones that is... Although, he derived that in tandem with Wolfgang Pauli. And he analyzed Wolfgang Pauli's
Pauli,
dreams.
the chemist.
The physicist.
The physicist, sorry.
Yes, and a major league physicist. Pauli was a real genius. And so those ideas were developed in tandem with Pauli. But in any case, look, here's the essential idea, and you can make of it what you want. There's a way of interpreting the world that's a narrative interpretation. And that's the world of values, essentially. And it's the world of behavior. And it's values and behavior because you don't behave unless you value. Because you're always behaving, in relationship to a goal, and that goal is selected from other goals, and you have to value that goal or you wouldn't select it. Behavior and values, that's the narrative world. And then there's the objective world, which is value-free, where all facts are of equal value. For Jung, the narrative and the objective world would sometimes touch. And that's what he called a meaningful coincidence. And, well, I won't go into it much more than that. Those occur in your life when something happens that strikes you as incredibly meaningful and too much to be a coincidence. Now, look, I know perfectly well that happens to people with schizophrenia often enough so that it becomes part of the pathology. That's a mechanism that can go very badly astray. But, well, I won't say much than that. It's a compelling idea that the narrative and the objective touch from time to time, because it's also hard to see how they can be entirely separate. So, anyways.
I think for me, what happens is it's kind of the signal to noise ratio or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
So if you and I, given all of our public engagements, I mean, I remember you, and actually that had touched me. At one point, you were predicting that they would be the downfall of Jordan Peterson when somehow you will say something wrong that will result in the collapse of the Jordan reality. And I'm glad that it hasn't happened, and may it never happen. It hasn't happened yet.
Bart Simpson said to his dad, "Dad, this is the worst day of my life." And Homer said, "The worst day of your life so far, Bart. The worst day of your life so far."
Right.
Yes, I haven't said anything that's killed me yet.
So now I'm gonna, in a sense, try to reattempt to encapsulate some of the problems I have with Jung. So, if you and I were to take all the positions that we've taken so far in our lives, thousands and thousands of hours that you could find, all of our writings, and people might disagree or agree with some of this stuff, but it's all within the realm of something that could be defended. Okay, that's great. Now let's suppose I were to say, I have incontrovertible proof that the Earth is flat. As a matter of fact, there is absolutely no proof that the Earth is round. Okay, well, that would be a big kind of red flag against me. If I then said...
flat locally.
It is flat locally, true. So then if I were to say, there is absolutely no proof that spermatozoa is the mechanism by which an egg by which you fertilize an egg. There is no proof of that. It's not true. It's a Zionist hoax. Well, that's now two flags against me, right? So that even though the 33,000 other positions that I've taken are perfectly reasonable, I only took two positions, maybe in two obscure YouTube clips, that are so insane that they now cast doubt on the entire edifice of Gad Saad. It is through that lens that I have problems with Jung, whereby I can read some of his stuff and I go, that's pretty good stuff. And I, as I said, I conceded very early that a lot of his stuff could be so easily reconciled within our evolutionary frameworks that both you and I very much appreciate. And so in that sense, I'm Jungian. The problem comes that I can find those 2 or 3 cases, the spermatozoa case, the Earth is flat case, that are so insane, that are so hocus pocus, that it turns me off. That it makes
you'd have to present me with those, and before I could comment, and
the ghost of his dad and the beetle hitting and the synchronicity. They had talked earlier in a dream about the Nazi. I don't remember the details. I read that stuff a long time ago.
Oh yes, you read the biography.
Right, so it's hocus pocus, right? It doesn't impress me. It's as if I'm back in synagogue in Beirut, Lebanon, and I'm right now. You may be excited by that because you also have a religiosity, but I don't. I want to situate everything in a testable framework. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't appreciate the magisterial nature of life. That doesn't mean that I'm not spiritual. But when I put on my hat of the empiricist, of the scientist, I want to take every word that Jordan said and say, can I empirically test that or not? I may agree or disagree. Can I test it? If yes, then Jordan is still playing in the same epistemological playground as me. The problem with Jung for me is he goes off into la la land in many places. Now, unless you tell me that in all those excursions, too bad, Gad, you're too dumb to understand his profundity, then fine. But
okay, no, but I can tell you something. I can tell you something about that's worth thinking about, I think. The stories that you're relating come from his autobiography. It's sort of half and half. His secretary wrote it. And at the moment, unfortunately, I can't remember what the name of it is. Anyways, he had a dream. Let's see if I can find it here. Memories, Dreams, and Reflections.
Right.
Yes, that's the name. And Jung had a dream when he was old. I think he was in his 80s, but certainly in his late 70s, that he was speaking to thousands of people. And it was about that time that he had been approached with the idea of this biography by his secretary. And he used that dream to justify relating the autobiography in an attempt to bring his ideas to a wider population. And I've read that book. I read it, I think, 2 or 3 times. And I had mixed feelings about its, what would you say, suitability. It did bring his ideas to a much wider population. Right. But they're out of context. They're badly out of context. And that produces exactly the consequence that you just described. So I would like to say something about the beetle episode, though.
Do you want to describe it for those folks who may not know it?
Describe what I can remember.
Yeah.
He was talking to a patient about a dream, and in the dream, the patient had dreamed about a scarab beetle, if I remember correctly. And at that moment, a scarab beetle bounced out against the window.
Yeah.
Yes, that was that episode. And that's a synchronistic episode.
Exactly.
I can tell you something about clinical work that's quite interesting and about dreams. I had many experiences where I would be deep into my client's dreams. Okay, so first of all, I didn't do dream analysis that often. And I never forced it on anyone. And for most people, it's not helpful because most people don't remember their dreams. And actually, I think it's only helpful for people who are high in openness. And I think almost all of Jung's clients were very, very high in openness. And I think Jung's psychology is actually a psychology of open people. Anyways, having said all that, I did do a lot of dream analysis with some of my clients, and they were often clients who would remember 2 or 3 dreams a night. So dreams were a really dominant part of their life. And it was not that infrequent where something highly improbable would have happened in their life that corresponded to something that they had dreamt about. And now the problem with even discussing this is that these occurrences are so unique to the situation that you can't provide enough contextual detail to communicate their meaning. So for a given dream, I might have talked to that particular client for 1,000 hours, so I knew a lot about their history, about their family, about their fantasies, and then the dream would lay out a particular meaning, and then there would be an event that would be in correspondence with that. But there's no possible way to communicate that without sounding like you're completely out of your mind. Now, you can discount that as meaningless coincidence, and most of the time, and even perhaps all of the time, you should. But I couldn't always discount it like that. And that episode that Jung relates is exactly one of those things, is that decontextualized, there's nothing to it. And it is impossible to provide enough context.
Can I give you a cognitive explanation for that synchronicity business?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is something in decision theory, or maybe more generally cognitive psychology, called the cell A bias. So if I say right now, God damn it, every time I go into the shower, the phone rings. It's unbelievable. Every time I go into the shower, the phone rings. Well, here's what's happening, Jordan. there are actually, it's a 2 by 2 cell of possible events. I go into the shower or I don't go into the shower. The phone rings or the phone doesn't ring. Now, my brain only codes the occurrence of cell A, which is I went into the shower and the phone rang. The three other...
It's the only thing with significance.
Exactly. The three other cells, all of the millions of occurrences of the three other cells are never probabilistically incorporated into my statistical mind. And therefore, I genuinely feel that every time I go into the shower, the phone rings. So many of these synchronicity patterns, many of these links between a dream and then subsequent reality in the real world that appears to be a manifestation of synchronicity, is nothing more than a manifestation of the cell A bias. In other words, that's the way that our brain tricks us into creating meaning and recognizing patterns, where actually, if we were to look at the full statistical panoply of events, there is no synchronicity. So I think, with all due respect, I just put a big dent into the Jungian synchronicity argument.
I'm unwilling to defend it further. And I think that whenever there's an explanation that's cut and dried and simple, it's to be preferred.
Well, it is so...
Sometimes, God, the problem was often,
It is so delightful that you have... Excuse me for interrupting you. It is so delightful. It is a testament to your character that you have the humility to actually concede that point. Because it is... And actually, I think one of the points that you have here... Which one is it? I can't remember which one. It refers in a sense to vanity and, I think it's in the first book. Listen to someone as though they might have something important to say or something to that effect.
They might know something you don't.
You just demonstrated that you live by your words in listening with complete humility to my cell A bias and be willing to concede something which, in a sense, attacks a fundamental important hero to you, which is Jung. And of course,
well, I think it's true. I think that's a good explanation for what exaggerated experiences of meaning. See, the problem comes out in clinical work. Sometimes you're dealing with problems that are so extreme and situations that are so cataclysmic that you're out past the pale.
Yeah.
And there are very emotionally intense situations. And you take what you can get in a situation like that. And you can say, well, look, doesn't that open you up to, well, the sorts of things that you just described? And the answer to that is yes, it does. But that still doesn't alter the fundamental point. It also doesn't deal with what is truly an immense problem, which is the correspondence between the narrative world, which is really the one that we inhabit, the world of value, and the objective world.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad that we touched on it, because I think of all the topics that people have always wanted us to talk about, the number one topic is that issue. So I'm glad that we put it to bed, and thank you for your grace on that point. I want to go back to the book. By the way, people, what are you doing? Why aren't you pre-ordering this already? Well, actually, it's not pre-order because tomorrow it'll be out. So make sure to get a copy. And Jordan has kindly agreed to give 10% of all of his profits to the Dr. Gad Saad research funds. So thank you, Jordan, for that. Jordan, I wanted to ask you something. So I want to go back to one of those general questions from your the latest book, the latest 12 rules. Are there specific rules that are more operative to culture A than culture B, to biological sex, male versus female, to different life history stages that I'm at, or life's, you know what I mean? Because one way to look at them is that these are universal rules that allow us to live better lives, that are universal, they are time invariant, they are culturally invariant. That would be one way to look at them, which would make each of these rules very powerful. Or one could argue, no, they are contextually bound. These rules apply more in this setting. So, for example, even in your world of clinical psychology, I have another good friend of mine, a colleague at Concordia University, who is a trained clinical psychologist, but his interest is in studying cross-cultural differences in clinical disorders, right? Now, you would intuitively think that most disorders, I mean, OCD is OCD, and anxiety is anxiety, and depression is depression. But the reality is that there are some psychiatric disorders that are truly culture specific, that only happen amongst the Japanese for whatever cultural reason. So if I look at your 12 rules, am I putting on my hat of the human universal evolutionary psychologist? These rules apply to all people across all times, across all life stages? Or are they all qualified by certain... So where do we fall for each of these rules?
Well, I would say to the degree that the rules are successful, like the more successful they are in some sense, the more they touch on universal themes. But then I would say they're particular manifestations of that other structure I referred to earlier. So what's universal is the chaos order dimension.
Right.
And I could just elaborate on that very quickly.
Sure.
There's two broad classes of events in our lives that we have to contend with all the time. There's the class of events that occurs when we know what we're doing and where we're going, and that's roughly explored territory. And then there's all those things that remain outside our ability to predict and control. And that's equivalent to unexplored territory. And I mean that biologically. So I think our brain, roughly speaking, that we have modules in our brain for unexplored territory, and we have modules in our brain for explored territory. That's roughly left hemisphere for explored and right hemisphere for unexplored. It's not quite that simple, but that's not a bad first pass approximation. And then the good and evil dimension, that has something to do with human moral sensibility. And I think that is something that's good and evil per se, or something that are uniquely human. And I think they're an emergent consequence of self-consciousness and also our ability to see the future. So those are universal as far as I'm concerned, those principles. And then the rules are manifestations of those, or instruction sets on how to deal with those, let's say. I think that the rules do apply to some degree to people in different stages of their life. In the second book, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. That's pretty good for a rule for people who are coming out of late-stage adolescence and trying to catalyze an individual identity, right?
Yeah.
So, and that's sort of based on the idea. Imagine there's developmental stages. First you're egocentric but dependent on your parents. Whenever you encounter something unexpected, you just cry, and then your parents step in and fill the gap. And then at some point around 3 or 4, you're mobile enough and autonomous enough so that you can step a bit beyond your parents, and you start having friends, and then you become socialized. And then the end stage of that socialization is something like the choice of a specialization. And that's your identity, which is partly why I'm so upset about current discussions of identity, because identity is actually and I really wasn't clear about this till this year, why the identity issue bothered me so much. I knew it was partly because of restrictions on free speech. You say to me, I have to say the words about you that you demand, and I say I'm going to use my own damn words. It's a free speech issue, and I'm not going to let anybody force me to utter anything that I don't feel is part of my utterance. But there's more to it than that. There's also this that's implicit in the legislation, let's say, but also in the modern concept of identity that's constantly being foisted on us, that identity is best conceptualized as your felt sense of who you are right now. It's like, no, that's a really sparse and troublesome theory of identity. What your identity is, more particularly, is something that's the consequence of an extremely complex and lengthy negotiation between you and other people, because your identity, to be even useful to you, has to be a game that other people can play, which means they know the rules, and are willing to play. Otherwise, they're not going to play with you. And so, well, one of the things you do when you catalyze your identity, so you concentrate on one thing and work on it as hard as you can, I think that's rule. There's 2 rules like that in this book that make a matched pair. There's work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see what happens.
Rule 7.
Rule 7, yeah. And there's rule 2, imagine who you could be and then aim single-mindedly at that. Those are both essays on the necessity of disciplining yourself so that you can transform yourself into someone that has social market value, let's say. Yeah. And that means you have something to offer other people that they want.
Yeah.
And I think that is particularly relevant to people who are in late stage adolescence.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm looking at some. So I'm just going to read these out just so that people can get excited about, all the content of this book. Do you mind if I read them all out?
Go right ahead.
So rule 1, do not care. And interrupt me if at any point you want to say something, but at least I want to mention them on the record, even though the book is coming out tomorrow. So do not carelessly denigrate social institutions or creative achievement. We briefly looked at creativity earlier, and you rightfully mentioned that my desire for creativity comes from my open personality. I love that. Imagine who you could be and then aim single-handedly at that. Rule 2. Rule 3, do not hide unwanted things in the fog. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that one, Jordan. That sounds interesting.
Well, there's this Freudian idea of repression.
Right.
And that's sort of, you do something wrong and then you decide you're going to put that away. You have a full model of it, you put it away, and you don't, you force it down into the unconscious and it rattles around down there causing trouble. That isn't exactly, that can happen, I think, but that isn't generally the key to what makes what Freud was trying to get at with repression so clinically and practically valid. What it's more reasonable to think about it as a form of voluntary inattentiveness. So let's say, I use this example in the book. Let's say you find yourself irritated at your wife when she's showing some attention to a neighbor, and you're in a bad mood because of that. And you're in a bad mood and you notice it, but you don't go there. You can have discussions with people and you think, well, I'm not going there. And the reason you're not going there is because it's sort of surrounded by negative emotion, anger, defensiveness, and all that. And that there's something under the surface that hasn't been made explicit. And if you delved into it, it would cause a lot of trouble. And, maybe you'd figure out what was wrong, but there would be a lot of trouble. Well, that's the fog. It's like you react in a way that you don't want. So let's step one step backwards. You're acting. Why? Because you want to get what you want. You want to get what you desire. All right. Well, you perform your action and you don't get what you desire. You don't get your wife's attention, let's say. Maybe you're trying to pick up someone in a bar and you keep getting rebuffed. Well, the rebuff is a kind of fog.
Right.
You don't know why you're being rebuffed. If you're rebuffed 50 times in a row, there's going to be a lot of information in all those rejections. And you're going to have to think for a long time about what the patterns are that characterize those rejections. And then you're going to have to extract from that a picture of why you're inadequate, or why the opposite sex is corrupt and deceitful and prejudicial, which is the wrong conclusion to derive. And you'll build a picture of your own inadequacy, and then you have to notice how far you are away from the ideal as a consequence of that inadequacy, and then you have to rectify it. So you see, you can extract out information that would be salutary for the development of your personality from doing pattern analysis of repeated failures.
Right, sure.
Or you can just not do that.
I mean, that relates very much to, when you talk about internal versus external locus of control. Let's suppose I have failed 3 times in businesses. So to link back to your story about the rejections at the bar. But in this case, I'm an entrepreneur who has failed on 3 separate occasions in 3 separate business endeavors. If I am someone who is going to attribute each of those failures externally, it's God. It's because consumers are dumb. It's because they weren't sufficiently ready. The market wasn't ready for me. So I always attribute those failures externally. I am removing the possibility of having a feedback loop of learning where I attribute some of those failures to decisions that I made, so that when I go to my fourth business endeavor, I actually don't implement some of the reasons why I failed. So in a sense, your attribution style, internal versus external, could be contributing to you either going into the fog or getting out of the fog, correct?
Well, yeah, I think that's a useful way of looking at it. We could talk about internal versus external there too. So if you have an external locus of control, you view yourself as that which is being acted upon.
Right.
Now, that can be useful in many, many circumstances. So because you might say, for example, about this entrepreneur, that he should take failure base rates into account. 3 failures is nothing. Maybe you need 12 failures before you've gathered enough information to be a successful entrepreneur, right? So that's where external locus of control is actually useful. So you can't necessarily tell to begin with which one is going to work. If you always use an external locus of control, the problem then is that you're never driven to change anything about your fossilized ideas, and the old dead king that is operating your thoughts never gets dethroned. So that's a problem. The problem is if you have an internal locus of control and it always operates, the probability that you're going to get depressed is quite high, because every failure is your fault.
That's right.
And, it might be indicative of a fundamental flaw. So it's really tricky to get this balance right.
As a matter of fact, and I mean, of course, you would know this since you just hinted at it. When I tell my students about this fundamental attribution error of attributing successes internally and attributing failures externally, the only group that doesn't suffer from that glowing, rosy fundamental attribution error are depressives, right? And I'm not sure if the research now has said it clearly, whether it's because I start off with a non-rosy view of the world that causes me to be more likely to be depressed, or is it when I am in a bout of depression, the glosy goes away? Have they resolved the chicken and egg?
This is a good place to talk about something else that's somewhat archetypal. Every time you learn something, generally speaking, it comes as a surprise, right? And this is technically true, that which is not surprising contains no information. It's virtually a definition of information.
Right.
Okay. If it surprises you, it means it violates one of your presuppositions. Okay, so then now that means that presupposition has to die. And I mean die because it's actually instantiated on a biological platform. Let's say it's a neural structure or a neural pattern. I don't care. It's still a structure, even if it's a pattern. It'd be the interconnections between neurons. That thing has to be punished out of existence. It has to be extinguished. Now, exactly how much of it has to be extinguished, that's a very, very difficult question. Like, if you get rebuffed when you try to pick someone up in a bar, it might be because you are the most undesirable creep in the world. That's actually true for one person somewhere, right? So, and it might be you. Hopefully you don't leap to that conclusion immediately and you start with a smaller presupposition. Right. And there might be some externalization in that. In any case, a little part of you, every time you are surprised by something, a little part of you has to die. Some part of you has to die. Sometimes now, imagine that presuppositions are in a hierarchy. So some are essentially irrelevant to your continued actions and some are crucial. So a crucial one, imagine you're planning the future and you're married. Okay, the existence of your wife is a critical presupposition to your future plans, or many of them. And so if your relationship becomes endangered, or if her life is put in danger, then that's going to be very impactful because her absence is going to destroy a huge chunk of your map of the world. All right. The price we pay for learning is to die a little bit. The trick is to not die too much.
Right.
And so I think it was Alfred North Whitehead said that, we have to let our ideas die instead of us. That's the purpose of abstract thought. We can let our ideas die instead of us. But that needs to be built rebuilt to some degree because your ideas are you and they're actually alive too. And so when one of your ideas dies, that's a part of you. And it might be a big part of you. And it actually, on sometimes might be such a big part of you that you actually can't survive the experience. And that's a traumatic experience. It's like it's blown out so much of your presupposition network that you might not be able to get yourself back up and going again. And if you look at the genesis of depression, major depressive disorder, it's very, very frequently the case that the first episode is brought on by some major trauma, like some genuinely horrible event. And then the nervous system is somewhat compromised after that, and lesser events can produce an equal response. So it's no wonder we hide things in the fog. But sometimes when you hide something in the fog, it just grows. And then when it does come out, it's trauma. Like instead of having an argument about flirting, you end up in divorce court, debating who's going to have custody of your kids for the next 10 years.
Well, on a very pragmatic level, I could tell you that in my own marriage, the way that my wife and I deal with, we rarely, truly, frankly, have any conflicts, but the equivalent of your story about the flirtatious, there's a haircut, a flirtatious neighbor, if that were to happen, I'm someone who doesn't let things fester in me. And so I will confront the negative emotions that I'm feeling at the moment, deal with them, and then we hug it out and we move on. I'm very, very intolerant internally to an environment of stress, of poutiness, of turning. Maybe it's part of my openness. Maybe it's my gregariousness. Maybe so I can't function in that environment. So if I'm angry, you'll know it.
How sensitive are you to negative emotion? You're very enthusiastic. You're obviously very extroverted, but how sensitive are you to negative emotion?
So meaning that if I experience a negative emotion, how catastrophic will it be for me?
Yeah.
I think I can handle it well. Probably the most negative feedback that I ever can receive is one that is created in my own mind, meaning that I am my worst critic. I am my worst, right? I am a pathological perfectionist person. So most of the what I call the looping thoughts, right? The intrusive looping thoughts that would constitute the majority of my lived experience in terms of negative emotions, internal, stem from me imposing this on myself.
Well, I was wondering because, you said you're someone who's intolerant of poutiness and that sort of thing. And that I'm like that too. To the degree that I engage in conflict, it's usually because I see something like that happening and I want to get it cleared up.
Exactly.
And I think that might also be true on a social basis, insofar as at least my temperament operates that way. I think, I can see where this is going. Yeah. It doesn't look good. I'd rather say something about now than later.
And if I were going to kind of do a Freudian thing of linking it back to childhood and so on, I would say that, and I've never shared this ever publicly in the past. My home life with my parents was such that my parents, although they were married for 60 plus years, they got married in 1950. They're still both alive. Had an acrimonious relationship with one another, in that there was a lot of, if not overt hostility, certainly latent under, I used to always joke that all the horrors that I experienced in the Lebanese Civil War was nothing compared to some of the horrors of the conflicts between them, which wasn't always, it's not like they were beating each other up, but there was this constant hostility. And so maybe in part because of that, I seek to exactly never recreate that in my own home. And so, my wife and I have a lot of public displays of affection towards each other. And I think, my God, my children see the love that my wife and I express to each other in a given day more than the amount that I've seen my parents exhibit towards one another in 50 years. And so maybe that is part of the intolerance, which is I lived that and I don't want to replicate that. So maybe that's...
Certainly seems plausible. So the fog is what's created when you engage in acts of willful blindness. When you could know, but you decide that you don't want to.
Beautiful. I like it. Okay, let's go through the rest of I'm just going to read the rest of the rules, and then I'm going to ask you one personal question, and then we could wrap it up. Okay, so notice rule 4, notice that opportunity lurks where responsibility has been abdicated. Rule 5, do not do what you hate. Yes. Now, this could apply in that, and actually in my next book, I'm thinking of doing something similar to rule 5. I wake up at 56 and I realize, I never wanted to be a chartered accountant, and I really should have become an artist. Is that what you're referring to? Sort of kind of mitigate the possibility of doing something that you hate your whole life and then regretting it? Is that what you're getting at?
No, I was thinking that's the grand case. No, I was thinking it's more like if you do something that makes you contemptuous of yourself, you should notice that, and then maybe you should stop doing it. Like you should regard that as a piece of data. It's like, well, I can give you a personal example. When I was a graduate student, I was partying a lot, drinking a lot. I came from a culture where that was par for the course up in northern Alberta, and then I noticed, and I was doing my clinical work and trying to straighten up my life consciously, and
you disappeared. Oh yeah.
And when I was listening to my conscience, I noticed that the only time I did things that I regretted was when I was drinking too much. And I thought, well, do I want to keep doing things that I regret? Do I want to live like that? And the answer was, well, no. And so I stopped drinking. And there was other reasons. I was writing a lot. I was developing my professional career, and it was starting to interfere with that, with the high levels of productivity that I wanted to maintain. I was going to get married, and I didn't want to be drinking around my kids. There were other reasons, but the fundamental reason was I don't want to do things I regret. And so that looks like a way of stopping that. And so that was a thing I hated. So if you notice that you're doing something and you hate yourself for it, like you're upbraiding yourself. Sometimes you have to say, well, am I just being too self-critical? Because maybe you are, but assuming that you're not, assuming it happens repeatedly, and maybe other people would also agree, it's like, well, stop doing them. It's a form of lie. Yeah. It's the performative form of lying, I would say. And so that's what that rule concentrates on.
Abandon ideology, we already discussed. Rule 6, work as hard as you possibly can on at least one thing and see
here, let's make a quick detour in there.
Yeah.
If your simplification allows you to be easily on the side of moral virtue, then be careful, because you're probably simplifying for the moral virtue rather than for the accuracy of representation.
Right. I like it. Okay. Do you want me to restate number 7? We said it already, right? Number 8, try to make one room in your home as beautiful as possible. So we went from cleaning your room to beautifying a room. I like it. There's a continuity there. If old memories still upset you, write them down carefully and completely. Plan and work diligently to maintain the romance in your relationships. So here in your relationships, you're not restricting that to romantic relationships. It could be the romance.
Well, in this rule, it is.
It is that, okay.
Yeah, it's focused on an intimate relationship, and I'm trying to point out to people that, it's hard to make a great piece of art. It's hard to have a great romantic date. It's hard, and when you're seeking a mate, and you have to put yourself on your best behavior in order to manage that. That extra motivation might allow you to manage it now and then, but if you want to maintain that throughout your life, man, you have to. You should know that that's going to require a tremendous amount of conscious effort. In most cases. And it's worth it if you can do it.
And I don't want to share stories from my parents' dynamics, but they certainly could have benefited from Rule 10. Where were you when I was growing up, Jordan? Number 11, do not allow yourself to become... Okay, we've discussed that. And then Rule 12 is one of those great, grand rules. Be grateful in spite of your suffering. On a micro level, I often apply this rule instinctively. So, for example, I'm thinking that in the next week, here are 17 different things I have to do. And I mean, it's not suffering, but it's certainly stress inducing. And I'm pissed off and I'm overwhelmed. And then I say, you know what? Tonight at 6 o'clock, I'm going to sit down with my family. We're going to have a great meal. and I completely put the lens on only what's happening in 2 hours at 6, and suddenly all my anxiety goes away. And so, on a micro level, I've just instantiated what you said here in Rule 12, right?
Yes.
That makes sense.
Well, you're focusing on something that you're reminding yourself of what you have to be grateful about. Exactly. And I would say under conditions of duress, that becomes an act of courage. It's something like courage.
Let me ask you this. I'm sorry, go ahead. Finish your point.
No,
Finish.
well, you can be tormented by life enough so that resentment is a logical conclusion, but it's not helpful.
Yeah.
And so what's the antidote to that? Well, there's probably truth is an antidote to it. Beauty is an antidote to it. Gratitude is a direct antidote to it. And, I don't want to be all Pollyanna about that. Well, be grateful, look at, it could be worse. Other people suffer more than you. Those things are not helpful. Those statements are not helpful if someone's hurting. But to say, to the degree that this corrupts you psychologically, it's not going to be of any benefit to you or anyone else. You have reasons to be resentful, no doubt. Well, and I analyzed them in chapter 11, which is mostly, it's like, well, why are you resentful, deceitful, and arrogant? Well, nature is out to kill you. Culture is out to tyrannize over you. And you've got your malevolent soul to deal with. It's no bloody wonder you're resentful, deceitful, and arrogant. It's amazing if you can manage not to be, but you should still try to manage not to be. Gratitude helps in that.
I'm often amazed at the gratitude that people will show me where they write to me with usually a pretty serious problem, and I simply can't not respond because I think and I say, this person probably spent an hour writing this, and they just trusted me, and I will write something which to me makes me almost feel ashamed that the response I'm giving them is too banal and cliche-ish, even though I'm truly trying to be genuine. And then they reply to me often, first that they're amazed that I responded, which to me seems totally natural that I would. I mean, you took an hour of your time to write to me. But then they're so grateful of, whatever it is, I'll say something that I consider to be, don't worry about it. It's going to be a better day tomorrow. I understand the pain that you're going through. Life is beautiful. But, whatever. It's as if they're transformed, and
you're an ideal, because you have this celebrity status. You're an ideal, and what they're looking for is attention, and attention is a powerful currency, and you provide it. One of the things that really is unfortunate is that there's no possible way I can respond to all those letters. And
does that torture you? Does that make you feel bad that you're unable to give each person that attention?
Well, it really, really bothered me in the initial phases of my rise to popularity, let's say, or to notoriety, however you describe it. After a couple of months, I thought, this is absolutely impossible. There is no way I can do this. And then I thought, well, because there's no way I can do it, I'm not going to torture myself about it. I mean, letters pop up now and then that are really heart-rending, and I answer them, but I leave 99% of them unanswered, and it's really sad.
But see, remember earlier you asked me, how do I handle negative emotion? I said, I'm my worst source of negative emotions because I'm so punishing in the sort of exacting standards that I set for myself. So one source of angst that I get is when I don't respond to someone that I think I should have responded to, just because as is the case for you, I can't do it. Then I will often send out, maybe once a month, a tweet where I apologize. Like it's a collective self-flagellation of apologizing, that I apologize that I'm unable to answer everyone, but I try to read each one. That is trying to extirpate the sense of guilt that I feel at not having given you that attention, not having given you that source of gratitude, which had I given you that 5 minutes, maybe it would have changed your mood for the next week, and so it's a heavy burden to bear, right? Because and then my wife.
Well, you just can't do it well. That's the thing. Exactly. I mean, at some point, it's just not possible to do it well, and it's also, I think, the fact that the advice that you're giving, let's say, is rather cliched is probably a good thing, Gab, because, some of these letters are so detailed that to do them justice, you can't do them justice without a tremendous amount of investigation. And if you're wrong in your attempts to do good, you could do a lot of harm. So to say, well, I hear what you're saying, and I'm sorry that things aren't working out for you very well. Good luck. It's like, yeah, it's cliched, but it does indicate that you paid attention, and it isn't going to do any harm. So,
thanks, I appreciate that. Okay, last question. So in chapter 6 of the Parasitic Mind, I talk about ostrich parasitic syndrome, right? This is the collective malady of trying to, the metaphorical thing of the ostrich burying their head in the sand, ignoring reality. And
that's
then
fog.
That's fog, exactly. And so I then in a bout of humility, I say, well, let me kind of admit something to you all here. The guy who coined the term ostrich parasitic syndrome is actually the greatest ostrich of all when it comes to his former weight management, which is, I've gone through periods where historically I was very, very thin. And then starting in my early 20s until about 2 years ago, I, put on progressively a lot more weight. And the singular reason that happened is because I became the king of all ostriches, which is I buried my head in the sand, refused to weigh myself because I was afraid of the feedback that scale would give me. And so literally the guy who was talking about, don't succumb to ostrich parasitic syndrome was over 200 pounds because he was the biggest ostrich. So with that in mind, sort of the physicians can't heal thyself. And so in your case, having written these 2 books with these, fantastic 24 rules, are you able to look at these rules and say, you know what, 7 of these rules I'm really performing horribly at? I mean, you mentioned one of them earlier about, the excessive drinking that you were involved in the 80s. But are there any rules that you feel that you truly failed at, and by writing this book, you're now much better at them? Are there any rules that you think you were really well, positioned to write them because you perfected the instantiation of that rule? How do you contextualize your life trajectory juxtaposed to these 24 rules?
Well, I think the rules are aspirational, so that no matter how well you follow them, you're not following them well enough.
Okay.
Because they all shade out into some kind of unattainable perfection. I don't write about rules that I don't think apply to me. Right. I don't think they'd have any grip on me. And I do think that one of the reasons I've got away with being such a finger-wagging character in some sense is because I'm definitely wagging that finger at myself. I include myself among the stumbling morons that are, trying to, well, I shouldn't put it that way, really. That's not fair to anyone, but I don't feel that I'm some glowing moral paragon, and certainly the events of the last year of my life, let's say, have been sufficiently dramatic so that any thoughts of that I might have had have certainly vanished. So, I'm trying to make the right rules and to update them when necessary and trying to live by them. I've also tried to write about things that I've really found helpful in my own life and in my clinical practice. There are things that have worked, and the stories that I tell about them are stories about why they've worked. And I really hope that they're all done in the spirit of loving your enemy, let's say.
Right.
And I would say that most specifically because I've thought about that a lot, partly because I keep getting attacked by people in the press. Maybe I'm stupid enough to put my head on the chopping block, But it's not that easy to figure out who to talk to and who not to when you're trying to communicate. In any case, people savage my reputation one way or another, and then I watch my response, and I'm trying hard always not to get all gleeful to see someone who's taken me on, let's say, in some way, fail or be hurt. I don't see that people being hurt is all that helpful. People have to learn, and there's an element of justice that is necessary. Mercy and justice rule the world, and they're polar. They operate in synchrony. But, well, I guess I hope that people forgive me enough for my inadequacies so that the books remain useful.
Oh, I'm sure they will.
Maybe. Yeah. So far, so good.
To all your haters, let me remind you that it's already number 1 in Canada. I don't mean number 1 in a subcategory. I sometimes gloat about my book being number 1 in psychopathology or something. This is number 1 across all books. So that's a completely different ballgame.
Well, I got something else that's
go
about the book too. Well, there's one other thing I wanted to talk to you about briefly.
Sure.
Well, the first book was really, I would say, kind of conservative in its essential philosophy, but the second book is more on the liberal side. Like, it's arguing more for paying attention to pathologies of order rather than pathologies of chaos. And so I don't know what my critics are going to make of that. One reviewer said, well, he says that he's dealing with pathologies of order, but you can see his terror of chaos shining through. It's like, well, maybe.
So is your prediction that you will get less sort of politically inspired hate coming at you?
No, probably more.
Oh, wow.
There's no one you hate so much as someone who forces you to change their mind about you.
Very well said. Hey, Jordan, stay on the line so we could say our official goodbyes offline. What a pleasure to talk to you again. Continued health to you and to your family. You are a delight and a treasure. And again, please go out and order this book. A real pleasure to chat with you, Dr. Peterson. Cheers.
Thank you. It was nice talking with you.
Cheers. All right, let me stop this.